The air inside the museum was always cool, always still, like the breath had been drawn out of the building long ago and never quite returned. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, slanting gold across the marble floors and casting long shadows beneath the rows of silent exhibits. Beneath glass cases, fragments of history sat frozen: a rusted helmet, a pair of worn combat boots, a faded letter with the ink nearly dissolved into the paper. Every item felt like a whisper, caught mid-sentence. Howard Lane moved quietly through the gallery, his steps slow but steady. He wore a brown overcoat buttoned to the top, a wool cap tucked low over his graying brow, and in his hand he carried a folded piece of paper, creased from decades of opening and closing, reading and remembering. His shoulders were slightly hunched, more from memory than age, and his gaze scanned the room, not with awe, but with recognition. He stopped in front of a tall display of dog tags. They hung suspended on delicate wires, gently swaying under the subtle movement of the building's air system. The names had been worn smooth by time, the edges dulled like the voices they once answered to. Howard lifted his hand toward the glass, not to touch it, but to feel its presence, to close the space between the past and now. A voice cut through the hush. "Excuse me, sir. That section is reserved for veterans and family members. Please don't get too close to the display." The words, though not shouted, struck with a sharpness that echoed in the silence. The woman who spoke stood with a clipboard tucked against her chest. Her name tag read, Gretchen Moore. Her cardigan was pressed and neat, her expression polite but cool, the sort that wrapped every sentence in well-meaning assumption. She looked at him the way people often did when they weren't sure if the man in front of them was confused, senile, or simply lost. Howard drew his hand back slowly. He didn't argue. He nodded once and said, "Understood." He turned away without another glance and made his way deeper into the museum, toward the quieter halls that held the Korean War exhibits. They were older displays, tucked into the back corners where fewer visitors wandered. The lights here were dimmer, a few bulbs flickering with neglect, and dust clung to the edges of the signage. These were not the polished presentations of modern warfare or World War admiration. This section belonged to ghosts no one visited anymore. Howard paused in front of a wall of names. Unlike the Vietnam or World War memorials, this one was simple. A sheet of dark steel, the names stenciled in white, some already beginning to fade. He stood in front of it, scanning slowly, lips moving as he read each name to himself. He came to one near the bottom, and his eyes stopped. Lane, Howard J. Sargent, 1952 to 1954. The paint on the letters was chipped. A small star sat beside the name, indicating return. He stared at it for a long time, not out of vanity but out of disbelief that this piece of metal remembered him when so few others did. From the inside pocket of his coat, he drew a photograph. It was old, the edges curled and brittle. 5 young men sat on top of a tank, shirts off, laughing like they hadn't just survived a week of shelling. One held a wrench, one a deck of cards, another a harmonica. In the center, a much younger Howard, smiling like he had all the time in the world. In that quiet, the memory pulled him backward. Rain hammered the ground. The night was thick with smoke and the coppery scent of blood and metal. Howard was 21 years old, barefoot in a sea of mud, crouched beside a tank that had thrown a track. Shells fell in the distance, each one rattling his bones. He worked with raw, blistered hands, wrenching the machinery back into place. Every minute counted. Every second brought death closer. From behind him, a voice called out through the downpour, "Lane, if you fix that track, drinks are on me in Tokyo." Howard had shouted back without looking up, "You're on, Madison. Just don't die before the bill comes." Then the sound of laughter, brief and brave, swallowed by thunder. Back in the museum, Howard folded the photo and tucked it back into his coat. He exhaled through his nose, slow and quiet. He did not smile. He did not cry. Behind him, Gretchen Moore reappeared, clipboard in hand, brows pinched with the unyielding purpose of someone who always believed rules were kindness. "Sir, I'll need to ask you not to linger here. This wall is reserved for family members or confirmed veterans only." She squinted slightly, trying to place his presence in a neat category. He was not wearing a veteran's cap, not holding any paperwork. She mistook his silence for confusion. "Are you lost, sir?" Howard turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself. He only said, "No, ma'am, I know exactly where I am." Then he moved away, heading toward a wooden bench placed beneath a faded painting of soldiers trudging up a snowy ridge. The bench creaked beneath his weight as he sat, his hands worn and knotted from years of work, pulled from his coat the same folded piece of paper he always brought here. The commendation letter, the one no one ever officially presented, but which he had carried for nearly 70 years. Across the hall, Gretchen Moore stood still. She watched him for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly on the clipboard. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Near the entrance, the doors hissed open. A man in dress uniform stepped through, posture straight, eyes sharp with military focus. Howard did not look up, but the air had shifted. Quietly, something in the museum had begun to change. The man who entered moved with purpose. He wore a dark blue suit, not a full military uniform, but sharp enough to mark him as someone still tethered to discipline. Medals lined one breast pocket, understated yet unmistakable. He paused at the visitor kiosk, just long enough to nod at the greeter, then adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and scanned the room. Commander Richard Halston had once commanded 300 soldiers. Now he chaired the museum's Veteran Council and made quarterly appearances to deliver speeches few stayed to hear. Today, he was scheduled for a private donation ceremony in the archive wing, a pair of boots from his father's deployment in Germany. He hadn't expected a distraction, but his gaze locked onto something near the Korean War Memorial Wall, and his stride slowed. Howard Lane still sat on the bench, gazing down at the paper in his hands. He wasn't reading it anymore. He knew every word. He was simply remembering it. The edges of the letter had worn soft, like cloth, from the friction of decades. The ink was faded, but the signature at the bottom still pulsed with weight. Ms. Moore had stepped back toward the main hallway, now busying herself with a digital inventory list on her clipboard. She glanced up again and noticed the approaching man in the decorated suit. Her eyes brightened. "Commander Halston, welcome back. The archive team is setting up your reception space," she said, stepping briskly toward him. Commander Halston nodded politely but did not stop. His eyes remained on the old man at the bench. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice low. Ms. Moore glanced over her shoulder. "Oh, he wandered in earlier. He's been hovering around the tribute displays. I believe he's a local. Might have known someone listed on the wall." Halston narrowed his gaze. There was something about the man's posture, the way he held the paper. Not like a visitor, not like a relative, something deeper. "That man's not just visiting," Halston said. Ms. Moore gave a light chuckle. "I'm sure he means well, but he's been rather evasive when I asked if he needed help. I had to remind him not to touch the exhibits." He seemed a little confused. Halston turned to her fully now. His tone shifted. "What's his name?" She blinked. "I didn't ask." Without another word, Halston moved toward the bench. His shoes clicked sharply on the floor, echoing in the tall ceilings. As he approached, Howard finally looked up. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Halston stopped 3 feet away, his voice softened by something older than respect. "Sergeant Lane." Howard studied the face in front of him. Recognition slowly dawned, not on the name, but on the eyes. He nodded once. "Yes, sir, that's me." Halston took one breath, then lowered himself to one knee beside the bench. He removed his cap and held it against his chest. The motion was not ceremonial. It was sacred. "I'm Commander Richard Halston," he said. "My father was Private Louis Halston, 3rd Armor. He served in Korea under your command." Howard's expression didn't change, but his lips parted slightly. "Louis Halston, Jeep driver, foul mouth, good hands." Halston smiled faintly. That's the one. The room had hushed. Visitors turned slowly. Some lifted their phones, unsure of what they were witnessing. Ms. Moore stood frozen near the wall, the clipboard held tight against her chest. Halston stood and extended a hand. My father talked about you. Said you were the reason he came home. Howard looked at the hand, then reached out and took it. His grip was still strong, still sure. I just fixed the vehicles, he said quietly. Sir, you fixed the escape route. He said if that half-track hadn't run, they'd all have died. Howard shook his head, more out of humility than denial. I was just doing what needed doing. Halston turned, addressing the gathering visitors. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. This man right here is Sergeant Howard Lane, Korean War veteran, hero of the Han River extraction, unrecognized until now. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A few people stepped closer. One man removed his hat. A woman touched her chest. Ms. Moore stood silently, face flushing with color. Her clipboard now felt too heavy, too official, too false. Halston leaned down slightly and said, not to impress but to affirm, Sergeant, today you are not forgotten. Howard blinked slowly, but no tears came. He simply nodded again. I appreciate that, he said. It's been a long time since someone remembered. Halston stepped back and gestured toward the hall behind him. I think it's time we fix that. Howard rose to his feet with a quiet groan. The crowd parted as he walked, the paper still folded in his hand. People watched, silent now, as if suddenly the museum itself had grown heavier with meaning. And behind them all, Gretchen Moore remained still, her fingers resting on the clipboard, eyes locked on the man she had mistaken for a relic. The words she had spoken earlier now replayed in her mind, louder than anything in the room. The museum's grand hall was built to impress. Tall arched ceilings, flags hanging from metal rafters, and a sweeping staircase that led to the archive mezzanine above. It was the kind of space meant for ceremonies and quiet remembrance, though it had rarely known either in recent years. The glass above threw fractured light across the marble floor, catching on bronze plaques and the occasional teardrop fallen unnoticed. Howard Lane walked slowly beside Commander Halston, his steps measured not from weakness, but from reverence. His fingers were still wrapped gently around the folded paper in his hand. He did not speak. There was nothing more he needed to say. Not yet. Commander Halston motioned to the curator at the far end of the gallery. A short conversation passed between them, hushed and rapid. Then, something unusual happened. The museum's public address system clicked on. A soft hum passed through the speakers overhead, and then the curator's voice came through, calm and deliberate. May I have your attention, please? If you are in the Grand Gallery, we ask that you pause for just a moment. We have the honor of recognizing a man among us who has long deserved it. Visitors stopped. Conversations faded. The quiet became heavy, not uncomfortable, but anticipatory. A group of school children gathered near the foot of the stairs looked up, their teacher placing a hand on one boy's shoulder to keep him still. The curator continued. Sergeant Howard Lane served in the Korean War as a field mechanic. On March 3, 1953, under enemy fire, he repaired a disabled transport vehicle, allowing his unit to retreat and survive. His actions were never formally recognized, until now. Halston turned to Howard and stepped aside, giving the man room to be seen. Howard did not straighten his back. He did not puff his chest. He simply stood, exactly as he had during inspection lines 70 years ago. The curator walked forward with a small black case. He opened it slowly, and inside sat the Legion of Merit, its ribbon deep red, the medallion gleaming in the light. It looked impossibly new, out of place against Howard's time-worn coat. Commander Halston reached in and lifted it carefully. There is no statute of limitations on honor, he said, his voice clear and grounded. Today we return a piece of what was never given. Sergeant Lane, with gratitude and reverence, I present you the Legion of Merit for extraordinary service and valor. Howard didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice was steady. I served with good men. Some made it home, some didn't. This belongs to all of them." A soft round of applause followed. Not loud, not cheering, but warm and reverent. The sound of hands clapping in unity, not celebration. A quiet thank you. Gretchen Moore stood at the back of the room. Her clipboard now hung uselessly at her side. Her eyes were fixed on the medal in Howard's hand. She had no words, but the tightness in her throat told her the apology had already begun forming long before she realized it. Howard stepped away from the spotlight and approached a nearby display case, one that held parts from a tank engine nearly identical to the one he'd repaired in that freezing night so many years ago. He placed the medal down gently beside it. A young boy near the edge of the crowd turned to his mother and asked softly, "Is he a hero?" His mother nodded once. "Yes, he is." Howard glanced back once. He gave a small nod to Holston, to the curator, to no one in particular. Then he walked, slowly, back toward the quiet corners of the museum, the places where memory still whispered and silence still meant something. The memory did not come all at once. It arrived slowly, like the smell of oil on warm metal, or the sharp sting of wind on a mountain pass. Howard had walked these halls before, but today, the weight of the medal, the unexpected applause, and the silence that followed cracked something open that had long been sealed shut. He turned a corner into the Cold War exhibit, where fewer people wandered. There, tucked between maps of forgotten borders and outdated communication equipment, was a single display. A half-track axle, rusted but intact, mounted against a backdrop of faded battlefield photographs. Howard's fingers brushed the edge of the glass, and then the museum was gone. The sky was the color of ash, low and heavy with smoke. The world shook with the rhythmic beat of distant artillery. Mud sucked at every step, and the sharp metallic sting of diesel fuel hung thick in the air. He was 21 again, boots soaked through, uniform torn at the elbow, eyes wide not with fear, but with the constant demand of calculation. They had been pinned for hours. The snow that fell during the morning had turned to brown slush by noon, and now it was a battlefield swamp. The transport half-track had broken down in the worst possible spot. Halfway up a narrow trail, exposed on both sides, engine dead, tread twisted and thrown. Howard had dropped to his knees before the machine, his toolkit cracked open beside him, knuckles already bleeding. His commanding officer, Captain Riley, was shouting into a broken radio. Madison was pacing beside the ditch, scanning the tree line for movement. A private, just 18 and shaking, called out, "We're sitting ducks up here." Howard didn't respond. He was inside the housing now, shoulder deep in frozen gears, fingers numb and fumbling. The wrench slipped once, tearing skin. He bit down a curse and kept working. "Lane, how long?" Captain Riley yelled. "Give me 3 minutes," Howard shouted back. "Maybe 4 if I lose another finger." Shells began landing closer. The earth leapt underfoot. The men crouched lower. One began to cry softly, rocking back and forth. Howard's mind locked in. Not on fear, not on time, on torque, on thread alignment, on the sound a bolt makes when it seats just right. His breath came out in white clouds. His body shook with cold and focus. He could not feel his hands anymore, only the motion of them. He worked faster. One pin replaced, one tread realigned, a fuel line reattached with wire and prayer. Behind him, someone shouted, "They're moving in!" Then, a miracle. The engine sputtered, once, twice, then roared to life like a beast refusing death. Howard rolled back, soaked and shivering. "Go!" he yelled. "Move now!" The half-track lurched forward, tires digging through mud, engines screaming against the slope. The others followed, boots pounding the earth, some helping those who slipped, some too numb to think. Captain Riley caught Howard by the collar as he passed. "You're either the craziest bastard in Korea or the bravest." Howard wiped the grease from his face with a frozen sleeve. "Both," he muttered, "depending on the day." He never saw Riley again. The captain was killed 2 weeks later by a mortar strike outside Daegu. Madison made it home. So did 3 others from that hill. Howard carried the rest in silence. Back in the museum, he stood motionless before the rusted axle. He could still feel the vibration in his bones, still smell the oil and gunpowder. The years had passed, but the hands of that moment still reached through time and held him by the collar. He closed his eyes, just for a breath. The silence around him was no longer hollow. It was sacred. The museum had returned to a gentle rhythm. Visitors moved more carefully now, their voices lowered not by instruction, but by instinct. The echo of applause still seemed to linger, like a hymn, softly fading into stone. Howard remained near the Cold War exhibit, his hand resting against the glass as if it were an altar. His eyes were dry. He had shed his tears long ago. What remained now was not grief, but gravity, the weight of carrying names no one else remembered. The medal had been given, yes, but this moment, here in the shadow of steel and silence, was the truer recognition. Across the hall, Gretchen Moore watched him. She had returned to her usual post near the entrance, clipboard held lightly now, as if it might crumble if she gripped it too tightly. Her face was not red with shame, but pale with something quieter. A kind of unraveling had begun, not from one mistake, but from the realization that she had built her role on policies, not people. She watched the man she had dismissed, not just once, but repeatedly, and saw something she had not bothered to look for earlier. Not frailty, not confusion, but poise, precision. A man who still stood with the weight of formation in his shoulders. Visitors passed between them, unaware of the private reckoning unfolding just beneath the museum's polished calm. Gretchen's lips parted, but no words came. What could she say that would not feel insufficient? She remembered how he had lowered his hand when she told him not to touch the display, the way he had nodded, not in apology, but in patience, in restraint. She had mistaken his silence for ignorance, his calm for weakness. Now she saw it for what it was. Discipline, decades old, and unshaken. Near the children's wing, a tour guide redirected a group of middle school students toward the flight exhibit. The space filled briefly with the sound of their sneakers and quiet chatter. Then it hushed again, naturally, as though the air itself understood that something sacred had occurred today. Commander Halston approached from a side gallery.
He no longer looked like a man fulfilling a duty. His expression had softened into something more reflective, as if the medal ceremony had changed him too. He noticed Gretchen standing alone. She straightened slightly when he neared, not in fear, but from habit. A woman who had lived much of her life trying to be correct. "Did you know who he was?" Halston asked gently. Gretchen hesitated, then shook her head. "I didn't ask. I just assumed."
Halston nodded once, not to accuse, only to acknowledge. There was no lecture in his tone. "He saved my father's life. That's not something you forget, but it's easy for others to never know." "I thought he was lost," she admitted. "Confused. I thought he was in the wrong place." "He's been in the right place for 70 years, Halston said. "The rest of us just took too long to meet him there." She said nothing, but her eyes followed Howard, still standing before the display, still honoring men long gone. Then, without waiting for permission, she set down her clipboard on the volunteer desk. She walked quietly toward the Korean War Memorial Wall, the one she had guarded so rigidly that morning. When she reached it, she placed a single hand on the base of the frame, then slowly lowered herself to one knee. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a woman kneeling before names she had never read until today. In the background, Howard finally turned. He saw her, not as the woman who had scolded him, but as someone trying to understand. And in that small moment, he nodded once. Nothing more, but it was enough. The day was beginning to wane. Afternoon light slipped through the museum windows in long golden ribbons, stretching across the marble like the hands of memory itself. Visitors had thinned. The ones who remained walked with softer footsteps now, as if the air had grown heavier with meaning. Howard Lane stood again before the Korean War Memorial Wall. This time, he wasn't alone. Commander Halston stood a few steps behind him, arms folded, gaze steady. Several museum staff members had gathered silently near the edge of the room. Even the janitor, still holding his mop, paused at the corner, unwilling to break the stillness with anything so mundane as motion. Howard stared at his name. The letters were still there, unchanged. Lane, Howard J. Sargent. 1952 to 1954. Beside it, the small white star that had always marked his safe return now seemed to shimmer with something more, as if it had just today been earned in full. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat once more. But this time, it was not the old commendation letter he drew forth. It was the medal, the Legion of Merit, freshly pinned, still gleaming, heavy with the weight of 7 decades. He held it in his palm for a moment, studying its details, the way the gold curled into sharp wings, the way the ribbon's red felt deeper now than it had earlier that day. Then, without flourish, he reached forward and gently placed it at the base of the wall, resting it against the plaque like a gift laid at a grave. He did not speak. No speech, no declaration, just the soft click of metal against stone. A few visitors lowered their heads. A woman from the education office pressed a tissue to her cheek. One child took his father's hand. No one clapped this time. No one needed to. His fingers lingered on the wall. His touch was feather-light, tracing over the names beside his own. Riley, the captain, the one who hadn't made it back, the man who'd yelled through smoke and fire, who had trusted Howard with the impossible. He had carried that trust every day since. He reached into his coat one final time. He pulled out the photograph. 5 young men, sunburnt and smiling on a tank in the middle of hell. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it beside the medal. He straightened slowly, bones creaking like old armor. Then he spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "That's where it belongs." Halston stepped forward, not to retrieve the medal, but to stand beside the man who had carried so many names with him for so long. "Are you sure?" he asked. Howard nodded. "They've waited longer than I have." Halston placed a hand gently on his shoulder. It stayed there for a long, quiet breath. Then he turned to the curator, who gave a small nod and motioned to the exhibit staff. Later that evening, the museum would install a plaque beside the photograph and medal, a new piece for the Korean War section. It would read, "Sergeant Howard J. Lane, mechanic, hero, witness. Sometimes the bravest work happens far from the spotlight." This medal, returned by his own hand, honors those who never came home. Howard turned and began the walk toward the exit. But this time, people stepped aside, not out of confusion, but respect, and Gretchen Moore stood once more near the entrance. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't explain. She simply said, "Thank you for coming." Howard paused, then tipped his head slightly. "Thank you for letting me stay." The museum lights had dimmed with the shifting sun, casting long shadows across the exhibits as closing time approached. The last few visitors moved in respectful silence, their voices low, as though afraid to disturb something sacred left hanging in the air. Howard Lane stood near the main exit, his coat buttoned once more, his cap tucked under one arm. He wasn't in a hurry. The world outside could wait. Inside these walls, time felt slower, gentler, as if the building itself knew it had just witnessed something important. Near the memorial wall, staff moved quietly, arranging a new display. The photograph had been mounted behind protective glass. The medal was carefully placed beneath it, and beside them, a simple bronze plaque, the lettering deep and clean. "Let this honor speak for the unspoken." Howard didn't watch them work. He'd already said goodbye. Gretchen Moore stood a few feet behind him, hands clasped in front of her. She hadn't spoken again since thanking him. She didn't need to. Her presence now was not out of duty, but respect. A young man in a museum polo approached with a folded flag, offering it without words. Howard accepted it with a quiet nod and held it close, the fabric pressing into his chest like the memory of a long-lost brother's hand. Commander Halston reappeared. his face thoughtful, posture as steady as it had been during the medal ceremony. But now there was something softer in his eyes, the weight of legacy, passed from one generation to the next. "You sure you don't want us to keep the medal for you?" he asked. Howard shook his head gently. "It's right where it belongs. The wall doesn't need more names. It just needs more remembering." Halston extended a hand. They shook once more, the grip firm, wordless, respectful. Then, for a brief moment, no one moved. The flag in Howard's arms, the air still and full of light. The museum doors slowly opening to a world outside that would never know the full weight of the moments that had just unfolded. As he stepped out onto the stone steps, the evening air met him with a soft breeze. Trees rustled overhead, and somewhere down the street, a child's laughter echoed faintly. Howard paused. He looked up at the sky, the color now caught between gold and fading blue, and gave a slight, knowing smile, not of joy, but of peace. Not everything had been said, not everything ever could be, but something important had been seen, and that was enough. Behind him, the museum lights remained on, a silent watch, a lasting salute. Some medals shine in glass cases, others live in silence and oil-stained hands. Today, we remember, always forward. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.